All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our webinar on Islamism and geopolitics in Asia. I am Ilan Berman. I am the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council. I wanted to welcome you to what is the fourth in a series of virtual events that we're doing on the changing nature of Islamic extremism and the global struggle against it. This session, like our last session, is intended to focus on Islamism, but in this session also we're broadening the conversation a bit and looking at the intersection of Islamism and geopolitics in Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. Like our last sessions, today's event is tied to, and it draws heavily from AFPC's World Almanac of Islamism. For those of you who might not yet be familiar with it, the Almanac is one of the American Foreign Policy Council's keystone projects, and it's a scholarly web and print resource that's designed to track trends in political Islam over time. It's an effort that we've administered for a decade now, and we just closed out our 2021 edition, which will be out later in 2021 from the Rowman and Littlefield Publishing Group. But it's also available online. And all of the chapters that will emerge in the print edition can already be found on the Almanac website, almanac.afpc.org. I encourage all of you to visit us online and explore it for yourselves. When you do, you'll see that the Almanac is truly a massive effort, and it brings together dozens of world-class scholars from all over the world to provide a truly global look at the phenomenon that is Islamism. And I'm delighted that three of those scholars, three of those contributors have accepted my invitation to chat with me this morning about Islamism and geopolitics in Asia. And let me introduce them in turn. Ajai Sahni is the executive director of the Institute for Conflict Management in New Delhi, and he administers the South Asia Terrorism Portal, which is the most comprehensive resource available on extremism groups active in the Asia-Pacific region. Michael Kugelman is the deputy director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And Michael Sobolik is my colleague here at the American Foreign Policy Council, where he serves as fellow for Indo-Pacific Studies. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we get started, a few administrative notes for our audience participants. As you'll notice, the chat function for all attendees has been disabled. If you have a question for the speakers, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of our screens. I'll curate the questions and pose them to the speakers if and when appropriate. Apologies in advance if we don't get a chance to get to all of the questions that are asked. We're going to try to keep this as much of a fluid conversation as possible. The program is also being recorded and will be posted shortly on AFPC's YouTube channel with a link to it from our website, www.afpc.org. And if you caught our previous webinars, you already know more or less how we run these things. Rather than having formal presentations, we try to make our webinars essentially a conversation, which we've discovered tends to be more interesting and more substantive in terms of drawing out interesting comments, thoughts, ideas, trends. So with that in mind, I've prepared a few questions of my own to get our collective juices flowing. So let's start. My first question is to Ajai. Ajay, I want to start with the big news of the last year and a half, right? At least in counterterrorism circles, the collapse of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria in 2019, and the the repositioning, the global repositioning that's happened by ISIS itself, but also by its affiliate groups. This has had a profound change and a profound reconfiguration of global politics as it relates to extremism, as it relates to Islamist groups. And a lot of it has taken place in Asia. And I was wondering if you could talk for a minute about what you're seeing. How has this phenomenon, how has the repositioning, the collapse of ISIS and the repositioning, how has it affected Asia, South Asia, but Asia more broadly? Ajay, 1 second, you're muted.
Yes, Well, the
Perfect.
first thing I think we need to recognize is that across the globe, not just in South Asia, in Asia, we've seen a dramatic decline in Islamist terrorism. And that includes Islamic State terrorism, Daesh terrorism. The second thing that I'd like to emphasize is that I never really believe the assessment of the Islamic State's outreach to be valid. It controlled a very significant area in Iraq, Syria at one point of time. But most of the groups who were calling themselves affiliates of the Islamic State, and some of those had formally affiliated or given birth to the Islamic State, were essentially groups that were already operating in their home regions. It was a rebranding. We did not see any dramatic escalation, alteration, flow of resources, flow of technologies, flow of manpower into any of these existing theaters of terrorism. So I do believe that at least in Asia, with occasional exception, no doubt, at least in Asia, there was no major, shall we say, transformation of the nature and quantum of terrorism as a result of ISIS success in Iraq, Syria. The other very important, and I'll make this point quickly, a point that I feel that has led to a great deal of myth-making and a great deal of misinterpretation is the neglect to address the role of states. You know, we constantly keep on talking about Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or of the various other groupings, Al-Shabaab or Lashkar-e-Taiba or whatever. And we ignore the almost decisive and pervasive role of states in the genesis and the sustenance of terrorism. And this can be acts of active commission and acts of omission as well, but very largely acts of active commission. And I think there needs to be much greater focus on this role of the states rather than simply talking about the rise and fall of groups, because as long as the vacuum of power and the shall we say, the chaos, the turbulence that states are creating intentionally in many cases, as long as that kind of turbulence persists as a result of state action, I'm afraid whether it's ISIS or another group, somebody or the other is going to fill that vacuum.
No, that's a great start and a very provocative start, I think. And I want to drill into that further, and that actually leads me to my question for Michael K. Because the sort of the trend lines that we're seeing in terms of Islamism in the Muslim majority countries of South Asia, and even the region's non-Muslim states like India, things are changing, and there are sort of new trends, but also new threats from Islamism. Can you talk about that a little bit, and sort of what we're seeing and what we should look out for?
Sure. I think first it's important to note for context that Islamism is a pretty broad term. And I think that I would identify three different types of representations of Islamism in South Asia. One, Islamist terrorism, which we just heard about. Two, Islamic political parties with varying ideologies, global ones like Jamaat Islami that have chapters in different South Asian countries, along with local Islamic political parties like Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan in Pakistan. And third are what I would describe as Islamic civil society organizations, and these include Muslim charities, some of which are unfortunately affiliated with terror groups like Jamaat-ud-Dawa in Pakistan. But at any rate, three quick observations based on those three categories. First, the threat posed by the Islamist terror groups in South Asia remains real. But as was noted before, it really has receded. And I think that this threat of Islamist terror is in South Asia today most pressing in Afghanistan, where the bulk of the region's Islamist terror groups are based. You have these groups that are still present in Pakistan. There have been counterterrorism operations that have reduced this threat in recent years. Bangladesh is a place where there had been a surge of Islamist extremist terror several years ago. Authorities cracked down hard, the threat has declined. In India, there's never really been a major threat of homegrown Islamist terror. There was a group called Indian Mujahideen some years ago, that was tied to Lashkar-e-Taiba. It's basically been eliminated. Second point, there has indeed been a surge in Islamist advocacy, as I would describe it in South Asia, emanating mostly from the Islamic religious parties and Islamic civil society groups. And these entities, they have clout in South Asia, but this clout, I think, tends to be manifested not through the ballot box, but more so through street mobilizations, pressure campaigns on governments, and also the posting of material online to attract members and supporters. And then these groups have in many cases achieved their objectives. One example in Bangladesh, Islam, which is a very large Islamic movement, it's held huge protests in recent years that have led to decisions by Dhaka to change the content of school textbooks, to remove a statue of a woman depicting Lady Justice that had been in front of the Supreme Court, and even to arrest bloggers deemed to be too critical of Islam. Third and finally, while South Asian governments have generally cracked down hard on Islamist terror groups, with some exceptions for sure, responses to Islamists that are not terrorists have been quite inconsistent. So, you know, as I suggested before, Islamists in Pakistan frequently hold large street protests, and they also quietly pressure the government, and they oftentimes get what they want. But when these folks do things that threaten the government, such as when Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan threatened to attack judges and soldiers after a Christian woman was acquitted after a blasphemy conviction, then the government stepped in to rein these groups in. There's also been some efforts to crack down on the hate speech coming out of these hardline Islamist figures. This has happened in Bangladesh and Pakistan. There haven't really been that many efforts to crack down on Islamic charities, including those tied to terror groups, mainly because these charities, they provide services that governments often struggle to provide themselves, and they know that if they crack down on these charities, there would be a backlash that could cause governments to lose public support. And just quickly, a word about India. The situation is different. Most indigenous Islamist terror threats, like the IM, which I mentioned before, have been eliminated. But you know, the South Asia chapters, South Asia chapters of terror groups have long had India in their crosshairs, and they hope to draw support from within an Indian Muslim community that at a moment when many within this community feel threatened by a Hindu nationalist government with leaders that have used communal language against Muslims and passed laws perceived to discriminate against them. So I do think the actions of the Modi government drive up the risks of radicalization within an Indian Muslim community that to this point hasn't been susceptible to radicalization.
Well, thank you for that. That was a masterful sort of tour of the horizon. There's a lot there that I'm going to pull on sort of as we continue through this conversation. Let me, for the moment though, let me shift gears slightly and turn to Michael S. and talk a little bit about China. Since 2013, the Belton Road Initiative, or alternatively the One Belt, One Road Initiative, has emerged as the Chinese government's signature foreign policy initiative. Can you talk a little bit about what this project entails and how it intersects with Islam and with Islamism? Because that's a phenomenon that I think is deeply important, but also really not well understood.
Gladly, and thanks to Ilan, and thanks for fellow panelists for pulling all this together. It's great to talk with everyone today. With the Belton Road, there's the detailed understanding, then there's the broader based understanding. So drilling down to the trees versus the forest, China is motivated to try to pull off a project as big and grand as the Belton Road Initiative for a number of reasons, but internally, their labor pool is getting older and labor costs are going up. So the manufacturing push that's been a huge engine of growth for China for a while, it has been slowing down. It's going to continue to slow down, especially relative to the other economies in Asia. So Beijing has a lot of economic rationale to do what they're doing, but that's really an incomplete understanding of the Belton Road, because if you only look at it in terms of one-off infrastructure projects or investment deals, you really miss the strategic rationale of the project, which offensively is the Chinese Communist Party's theory and method for achieving first regional hegemony and then building beyond that. And if you look at the scope of the Belton Road, this is not, it may have started as a regional proposition, but it is global in its entire focus, and certainly in its branding and in the way it's being executed. I mean, one of the interesting things last year during the coronavirus was a bit more discussion about the health Silk Road. And Beijing also has an Arctic Silk Road. I even saw this really strange article one time about a Bible Silk Road, which in the Chinese context now is very interesting. But all that to say, this is a concept about a way of life. Belton Road, yes, the nuts and bolts of it have to do with investment, infrastructure, but it is the vision of a Chinese-led world order. But if you look at it from a defensive perspective, this is necessary, like something like the Belton Road is necessary for China now, because the problems they have geographically, being hemmed into the east with water and having historically a lot of issues to the west, none of this stuff is old or new rather for China. I mean, as long as the concept of China has been around, China has been struggling to push westward further into Eurasia, not just militarily, but economically, diplomatically. And this gets to your question about what does this mean for Islam and Islamism. Xinjiang, which is the westernmost territory in China, is home currently to a lot of ethnic and religious minorities who are Muslim in nature, Uyghurs specifically. And this has been an issue of huge focus in Washington, mainly because of the genocide determination that the prior administration made. But this is a huge thorn in the side from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, because they need that region to be pacified and Sinized, basically, for a predictable passage of routes for the Belton Road. Like 3 of the 6 land routes pass through Xinjiang. And if you, I did a study on this last year, and if you look at the infrastructure built out in Xinjiang that corresponds with Belton Road, and you look at the construction of the camps, the internment re-education camps for the Uyghurs, there's a lot of coincidence there. So all that to say, it's really impossible to understand why China is doing what it's doing, particularly in the terrestrial component of the Eurasian part of the Belt and Road, without accounting for their own Islamic minorities in Xinjiang.
No, that's a great overview, and I'm gonna circle back because I do want to talk specifically about the outgoing administration's genocide determination a little bit later, and sort of what that means for the current administration and sort of how it's going to shape Asia policy. But this is actually, I think, a really good pivot for us, because we're trying to juggle a couple things. So we just talked about Islamist trends. I want to talk a little bit more geopolitically focused. And so, Ajai, back to you. Over the last year, the historic tensions between India and Pakistan have spiked once again. And this is sort of, there's an ebb and flow and a cadence to all this. But can you talk about what accounts for sort of the new rise in acrimony, animosity, tensions, and where you see things heading from here?
Well, first of all, I don't really see what is happening as a particular spike. I see it as a continuum. As you say, there's a cadence to this, and we've had periods of far greater and overt violence right up till 2005, 2006, where we're seeing a high intensity conflicts in Kashmir alone, and terrorist acts by Pakistan-backed and Pakistan-based groupings across India till 2009. So I wouldn't really say there is an extraordinary spike in tensions between them. But yes, if we compare the pre-2014, the 2 or 3 years before 2014 to the years after, well, I think Michael Kay made this point that, the Hindutva factor and the BJP's ideological position, and I would suggest the manifestation of that ideological position in policy, particularly the August 2019 dilution. People describe it as an abrogation. The article is still theoretically in existence, of Article 370, the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, and certain policies that have been manifestly communal on the part of the central government, or are seen widely as being communal by or at least significant proportions of the public, and certainly by Pakistan, have created a backlash, have created pressure in Pakistan to raise the rhetoric. Also, if you see the post-Pulwama, the major terrorist attack in which 40 Indian security force personnel were killed, and the Indian retaliation, a sort of new lines were crossed, new parameters were defined in terms of India-Pakistan relationships. For the first time, India crossed over into Pakistani airspace, targeted alleged terrorist camp, drew with retaliation. So this kind of an armed conflict has come into brought war, you could say, far closer than it was seen to be in earlier days. Having said that, I would also say that war has broken out, as in the Kargil instance, when no one was expecting it. So it's not as if there is a continuum from heightened tensions to war. That's not the way it sort of works out. The other thing is, I think, and this is something Michael S. has also been talking about in terms of the Chinese hegemonic influence, if we may say, at this juncture, and the greater and greater overt aggression, the challenge along our borders, would certainly encourage its all-weather friend, as they describe Pakistan, to be a little more adventuresome. So that's an encouragement. Another encouragement is the trajectory of developments in Afghanistan. In many ways, Pakistan has been gifted by the international community almost everything it wanted. A pivotal role on the negotiating table, its proxies or close affiliates playing a defining role in Afghanistan itself, the visible possibility of a Taliban rule being restored in at least parts of Afghanistan if the American withdrawal proceeds as Trump had said, and we see no reason. I mean, there's been talk, of course, in the new administration of a review, but nobody believes that you're going to send large numbers of forces back into Afghanistan. If that happens, it's a different thing, of course. But there is much encouragement for Pakistan's traditional adventurism in Afghanistan and against India at this juncture in the development of in developments across the region.
No, that's a great overview, and I'm glad you mentioned Afghanistan, because that sort of segues very nicely to what I wanted to ask you, Michael K. In the context of Afghanistan, over the past year, we've seen major momentum towards a truce, the quote unquote truce with the Taliban. And that state of affairs has left the Taliban very much with the upper hand in terms of its political and strategic relations with the government in Kabul. What are the potential implications of the settlement that we've seen unfolding with fits and starts over the past year? What are the implications now for the country?
Yeah, numerous implications flowing from that settlement, which was signed almost a year ago. And I'll just highlight two. First, it set a formal timetable for a withdrawal of U.S. forces. All U.S. troops per this agreement are to withdraw by early May, by May 1st, which is pretty soon, so long as the Taliban has upheld its commitments in the agreement. And those commitments do include ceasing cooperation with al-Qaeda. And there's no indication that that's happened yet. There's been a lot of reporting and assessments by the UN, for example, that indicate that senior leaders of the Taliban and al-Qaeda have continued to meet. And just the other day, there was a report released from the US Treasury Department indicating that al-Qaeda and the Taliban continue to share financing. The second key implication from that US-Taliban agreement, I think, is that it opened up a pathway to the peace process between Kabul and the Taliban, which began back in September. The Taliban had long vowed to hold peace talks with the Afghan government only after getting a troop withdrawal deal with the US. And I should say, a lot of people, I think, may think otherwise. It was the US, not the Taliban, that had long balked at direct talks between the US and the Taliban. And that's because Washington had always wanted Kabul to be in the room during those talks between the US and the Taliban. It was during the Trump era when the US government finally agreed to have those direct talks with the Taliban, with Kabul not in the room. At any rate, the Taliban got the US troop withdrawal deal that it had long designated as a precondition for Taliban talks with Kabul, and now it has launched talks with Kabul, though they haven't gotten very far. And one of the reasons they have not gotten very far is that there are some really sharp fundamental differences between the two sides. And this gets me back to our theme of Islamism. I would argue that this nascent, fragile peace and reconciliation process playing out in Afghanistan now is in many ways a battle over Islamism in Afghanistan. One of the very fundamental disagreements between the two sides, the Afghan government or the Afghan state and the Taliban, is over what type of Islamic system should govern Afghanistan after there's a political settlement. So Afghanistan currently has an Islamic system. Its constitution is rooted in Afghan law, which is in many ways Islamic law. Islam is the state religion. Courts apply Islamic jurisprudence, but the Taliban, of course, supports a much more rigid, draconian, troubling interpretation of Islamic law. It's been vague about what exactly it wants, but we can assume something similar to the incredibly oppressive theocracy that characterized Taliban rule in the late 1990s. And as you'll know, as your audience will know, there have been a rash of assassinations of civil society members in Afghanistan in recent months. Female journalists, female judges, democracy activists, and so on. And the Taliban has not claimed these acts, but I think it's quite clear that they're behind them, that they're staging them, at least most of them. And why would they do that? A number of reasons. One is to convey the impression that the government can't protect its people, which is true. But also, I think another motivation for the Taliban to stage these target killings is to try to eliminate the type of people that its preferred type of Islamic system rejects. So, bottom line, to wrap up, on one level, this very challenging peace process comes down to a battle for Islamism fought between the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which is the current government, and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is how the Taliban likes to itself to be known as. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. That's a wonderful wonderful overview. And actually, obviously, it's also a moving conversation because this is something that the new administration in Washington is going to need to tackle. So I want to come back to that. But before I do, I want to pivot back to what Michael S. was talking about and about the Belton Road and sort of China's grand hegemonic ambitions, because there's all sorts of implications for the United States, obviously, but also for American allies globally. So, Michael, the question is this. The concept of great power competition has now well and truly emerged at the forefront of U.S.-China relations. And I would argue also, sort of in a subsidiary fashion in relations between China and the West more broadly. But it's also very influential in terms of shaping the geopolitics of Asia. So spend a few minutes, walk us through how the region is reorienting to respond to greater Chinese adventurism and Chinese aggression.
So it's a really good question, because the entire region is in a lot of flux right now, and there isn't, this question hasn't fully been resolved yet, but it's really working out before our eyes day in, day out. So starting with, I guess, starting with Japan, last year, one of the interesting developments in the wake of the coronavirus, but more specifically the impact on critical supply chains, PPE, stuff like that, personal protective equipment. Japan responded to that by basically recognizing, look, this is playing out in real life, a possibility and a fear that our government and a lot of other governments have been wondering about, which is our supply chains are incredibly dependent on China. And this isn't really an example per se of Chinese adventurism or aggression, although I'll get to that in a few moments. But it's an interesting case study, because when Japan last year said that they would provide economic incentives to their companies either to reshore or to relocate from China, that was one of the biggest developments, I think, in the Indo-Pacific last year. Now, the question is, what's going to come of it? And I know that last year, this was a huge topic of conversation on Capitol Hill in Washington. And there are a lot of members of Congress that are very eager for domestic reasons, but also for geopolitical ones to, go through that same calculation that Japan has. But if you look, kind of pivot away from economics towards defense, military, the China-India border was one of the hottest things last year, and it's still an ongoing issue. And it was really interesting to watch that that competition along the border spill into the maritime region, not spilling into in terms of Chinese and Indian navies coming to blows or anything like that. But it's been really interesting to watch India pick up the pace of its capabilities. Like, for example, I think it was late last year, the Indian Navy released a highly advanced torpedo that when you combine it with something like a P-8 in the sky, the range of India's anti-submarine warfare increased in a really significant way last year. And then if you also look at that with the combination of the Quad, this informal collection of the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, a lot of the aggression that China's been directing, not just at India, but with Australia, particularly with economic embargoes, stuff like that, China has been doing the West and the United States a big favor, because there have been a lot of ongoing issues of cooperation between India and Australia, but those are really beginning to get smoothed out within the context of the Quad, and you're seeing the conversation and marginally the cooperation take steps closer and closer to something that you could call strategic. Five Eyes, it was interesting as well to watch with Australia and New Zealand in the Indo-Pacific as well. Last year, there was, at the proposal, I think, of Australia, a conversation of forming a trading bloc to blunt China's effectiveness to place an embargo on any member. And there was chatter about bringing Japan in. Now that's obviously a lot farther down the road, but the fact that people are talking about this is a signal that there is a big counter response to what China's been doing. But the final thing I'll say, that whole conversation was on talking about very advanced economies, very advanced democracies, and nations with which the United States has pretty firm relations with. If you look at smaller countries in the region, say Indonesia and Malaysia, they definitely took responses last year, particularly with the South China Sea and like competition with China over fisheries and stuff like that. But it's interesting to note the difference between those two. Indonesia moved its naval combat squad way further north than it was already, and they pushed it basically as close to the South China Sea as they could. But Indonesia's relationship to the South China Sea is nothing like that of the Philippines or Vietnam. Indonesia doesn't have nearly as much to lose, so they had a lot more room to push. And the issue that they have primarily with China is with fisheries and resources. It's not a party to the dispute that's been happening. With Malaysia, they took what at the time was kind of a surprising step. And if I recall, it was in May, when they sent a formal note to the UN echoing the words of the US and Australia, like formally rejecting the 9-dash line and China's claims to the South China Sea. But I think that the qualifier there is Australia's willingness to do that after the United States did it paved the way for a country like Malaysia to have a lot more regional flexibility and support to take a step like that. So anyways, all that to answer your question, there have been real markers of response across the board in the Indo-Pacific, but it's also important to understand why certain countries are acting the way they do, what their context is, and specifically how much flexibility they have on their own to push in response to China versus how much they need to be working in concert with others.
No, that's great. That's a great answer, in part because I think it really allows us to sort of understand the dynamism of what's happening in the region and how China may not be the engine, but China is certainly a major engine of geopolitical change that's taking place in Asia. And as you said, it's still ongoing. All right, so round three. And I want to talk about sort of where we're heading, and I want to talk about the still in formation policy of the Biden administration towards Asia, towards all these things that we discussed. Before I do, though, I want to invite all of our attendees, virtual attendees. If you have a question for the panelists, please throw it up in the Q&A, and I'll try to combine them and get to them and sort of adapt my questioning to make sure that they're that everything is sort of addressed as much as possible. Okay, so Ajai, back to you. I want to drill down on something that you sort of referenced in passing, because the bilateral relationship between Washington and New Delhi has improved pretty markedly on both the political and economic fronts over the last several years. And that's a sort of a track record of bipartisan accomplishment for sure, but it's also something that the Biden administration is going to feel a lot of pressure to build on. And so explain the dynamics here, and how do India's relations with its neighbors, and in particular Pakistan, which you mentioned, how does it sort of all factor in? Ajay, you're still muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
At a certain level, there is a structural imperative to better relationships between India and the United States, which is going to persist irrespective of partisan changes on either side, whichever government is in place. It is unlikely to be significantly derailed or altered in direction. So we will see more and more both trade and military cooperation between the two countries. However, the depth or intensity of the relationship will very substantially depend on the other factor that you're mentioning, America's orientation towards other countries in the region, most significantly Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China. Now, because these are the three nodes from which enormous pressure has been generated. Afghanistan, of course, because of the AFPAC angle, and because of the consequences of developments in Afghanistan on the potential for terrorism in all of the region, but very specifically on India in particular. So it will depend very significantly on the attitude and orientation that the Biden administration takes towards these three countries in particular, and what the outcomes are going to be, so that a greater faith is possibly established, greater trust is possibly established between Washington and Delhi. Now, as things are manifesting themselves at this very, very early stage, I don't see something very dramatic or particularly encouraging emerging from the Indian point of view. There seems to be a very, very great continuity in policy being indicated between the last administration and this administration towards the AFPAC region. Pakistan appears to not only retain centrality, but also this cover of impunity under which it has operated for decades now in terms of its sponsorship of terrorism. You have the same interlocutor, you have Zalmay Khalilzad continuing as the principal American interlocutor in the region. He has shown himself to be particularly favorable to or weak towards the Pakistani position and unable to defend the legitimate rights and demands of the Afghan position. We have an indication, the phrase is, I think, very important, that the new administration would follow or pursue a policy of strategic patience towards China. That can be good. We need patience. We don't need, knee-jerk responses. But if that translates into a policy of conciliation, can be perceived by China as a policy of weakness in a particular situation where, you see, you have talked about our border troubles with China. They're not the only border troubles. China is currently pushing against every single border except the Russian. It is challenging borders. It is expanding borders, certainly across South Asia, certainly in the Asia-Pacific regions, and Nepal these are friendly countries towards China. These are dependencies almost now, increasingly dependency. Myanmar and Nepal and even Pakistan, China is pushing the border towards, inwards towards in these countries. So I think unless America in particular, the West as a bloc, begins to push back, not only against this kind of border aggression, but also, intentional or otherwise, the crippling impact of Chinese economic policies, Chinese technological aggression, which is, at a certain level being translated or interpreted by Chinese strategists as a doctrine of unrestricted warfare. Now, whether the intention is to cripple the adversary or the intention is simply to promote aggressively Chinese interests, the impact is more or less the same, which is a crippling of capabilities of industries, of capacities, and of economic trends in these countries, and in India in particular. So unless some kind of an alternative is produced, and unless we start recognizing that the entire nature of global economics, and this is a point I'd like to very quickly say, socialism and capitalism are no longer issues. We still talk only of, this great opposition. Both socialism and capitalism are based on a land-labor capital economy that no longer exists. Or at least we can say land and labor are an increasingly marginalizing component of the production cycle. It's technology and capital in that order, because capital will follow technology where it is. And technology is based on an extensive chain below. The military industrial complex, education, science, technology, that whole sequence, which is based on social conditions in various. Unless we develop a model that can address these emerging factors and address Chinese aggression as a component of this new economics that is dominating the globe, we are going to fail, and we're going to fail catastrophically. And I'm not talking about India alone. I'm talking about a global failure.
Well, that is a fascinating topic to dig into. Certainly not here, but a discussion of economics and sort of the changing shape of the global economic system. But the point you made, I think, is sort of very interesting in terms of the fluid nature of the threats that India faces, and sort of the full court press that the Chinese are making. Before we get there, I want Michael S. to talk about that when we get to him. But before we do, I want to circle back to Michael K. and continue our conversation of Afghanistan. Ajai talked about the drawdown of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and you talked about sort of the unfolding contest for Islamism within Afghanistan as a function of sort of the post-U.S. presence, or the in the midst of the sort of diminishing U.S. presence. The Trump administration made no secret of its desire to withdraw from the Afghan conflict, and it did put a major retraction of U.S. forces into motion, and that retraction still continues. And as you said, right, later this spring, it's going to sort of to terminate. But the new administration obviously also gets a vote. What's your sense of sort of the evolving thinking in the Biden White House about the sort of the level of U.S. commitment to Afghanistan, where that conversation is heading, whether the Biden administration is prepared to sort of recommit significant troop presence to Afghanistan? Why or why not? What are they thinking?
Yeah, so I think Ajai before had said that we can expect some continuity in policy in South Asia from the administration. I think he said that. If that's what he said, I agree with him. There's a lot that Biden and Trump don't agree on, but I do think South Asia policy, including Afghanistan policy, is an example where they do see eye to eye. So to answer your question, I think the basic answer is no. That trajectory that you had laid out with the Trump administration wanting to get out, that's not going to change. Biden, like Trump, has no interest in a long-term U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. He was, of course, the lone vocal opponent of Barack Obama's troop surge plan when Obama was Biden's boss. And Biden has said more recently that his goal in Afghanistan is to maintain a small and agile counterterrorism focused force. But that's actually a tall order, I think, given that the U.S. Taliban agreement stipulates that all U.S. troops be out by May. And I think the Taliban is unlikely to sign off on U.S. forces sticking around in Afghanistan, even if they're there to fight terrorists that the Taliban does not get along with, like ISIS. Let's keep in mind that the Taliban is a rival of ISIS, and it's actually fought against ISIS. That said, I will say that this new administration will take a more careful and deliberative approach. I think it's going to take a long time to do its homework, which may not be reassuring to Afghans given the intensifying violence and the urgency of the situation. But this administration is going to move slowly initially. It will want to see what the Taliban committed to exactly in its deal with the U.S. And also it will want to look into what the U.S. should ideally be getting from the Taliban before U.S. forces leave Afghanistan. So I imagine the Biden administration will take several steps that the Trump administration apparently did not consider. First, I actually think that the Biden White House will push for an extension of that May 1st deadline for the withdrawal of all U.S. troops so that there's more time to try to work through issues in the peace process and get that on a more promising track. And I think the administration has a pretty good, strong argument. It could argue that since the intra-Afghan dialogue, the peace process, which was set in motion by the US Taliban deal, since that began much later than it was supposed to, it didn't begin until September of 2020, even though the US Taliban deal ended in February. Given that, it's reasonable to delay the withdrawal deadline by 3 to 6 months or so. Second step I expect the new administration to take, I imagine it will try, at least initially, to hold the Taliban's feet to the fire on the violence reduction issue in ways that the Trump administration did not. I mean, the Taliban violence is just out of control right now, not just on the battlefield, but also, in the heart of society, as I mentioned before, these targeted attacks on civil society leaders. So I think we can expect some engaged and perhaps tense conversations between the Biden administration and Pakistan, where Pakistan essentially pressures Islamabad to use its leverage over the Taliban to push them to reduce violence. No regional player has more leverage over the Taliban than Pakistan does because it's provided shelter to the Afghan leadership for a long time. Now, Pakistan claims that that leverage is exaggerated, which may be true to an extent, but it has leverage. It has more leverage than anyone else, including the United States. And I think the Biden administration may offer additional incentives as well to try to get the Taliban to agree to a violence reduction, such as by pursuing other concessions that the U.S. Taliban agreement puts out there for the Taliban, like taking steps to get the Taliban delisted from UN sanctions regimes. But this is all going to be very tough. And the Taliban has indicated it will not want to make concessions on violence until all troops have left Afghanistan, all U.S. troops have left. And at the end of the day, I really think that the main goal for this administration will not be moving the peace process forward, but more so figuring out how to maintain a counterterrorism capacity in Afghanistan, especially on the assumption that eventually all U.S. troops will leave Afghanistan in a matter of time. And that's hard to do. Maintaining a CT capacity in Afghanistan with no troops on the ground will be a tough policy not to crack. I mean, do you try to work with Pakistan, given that there has been a history in the past of the U.S. using bases, often covertly in Pakistan, to stage operations in Afghanistan, i.e. with the drone war. But the US-Pakistan political relationship is not such that one would think the Pakistanis would be open to having US forces on their soil. Could you look to a Central Asian country like Uzbekistan, providing basing arrangements for the US to use to launch CT operations? I don't know. Some Central Asian countries have laws that forbid the presence of US, of foreign troops on their soil. Could the Biden administration look to an ally in the Gulf for basing to use for operations, CT operations in Afghanistan? Well, the distance factor may be too significant. Or would the US simply try to keep forces on the ground covertly to play a counterterrorism role? So there are no easy options. There are no simple options. It's going to be a really hard set of policy choices that the Biden administration will have to deal with.
No, thanks for that. And I think your point about sort of the trajectory, all these things being equal and all these things being unwritten, but the trajectory seems to be pretty definitive. Which leads me sort of to my last prepared question for Michael S., because you talked at the very beginning, sort of when you started mapping out so to speak, the Belton Road. You mentioned in passing something that I actually think is super consequential in terms of defining the Biden administration's policy towards China moving forward, and that's the genocide determination that was made by the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo as one of the Trump administration's final policy moves. This is obviously, it was a long time coming. It was something that the State Department had debated for quite a while, as I think we all know. But the practical implications of that designation are potentially huge. If the Biden administration decides to look at the situation in Xinjiang and look at the Belton Road and sort of look at all the associated parts the same way that the Trump administration did. To your mind, what are the practical implications of the designation likely to be in terms of American policy moving forward? Is this something that the Biden administration is going to embrace, or is it not going to embrace, or is it going to do something halfway?
So it's interesting that we're talking about this now, because we're only a week plus 1 day into the Biden administration, and there's already been quite a bit of back and forth on this very topic. So sometime in 2020, I forget when, but at some point, President Biden, at the time candidate Biden, through a spokesperson, said that what was happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang was genocide. And then during his confirmation hearing, Secretary of State Blinken said that in his judgment, it was genocide as well. But then it was either later that day or the next day, the White House spokesperson said that the decision was under review. And then an anonymous NSC staffer, if I recall correctly, provided a clarification that it was genocide. And then the president's nominee to UN ambassador during her confirmation hearing, just like yesterday or 2 days ago, said that it was under review and that the protocol that the Trump administration used was improper. And then the very same day, Secretary of State Blinken said he wasn't aware of her comments and it's genocide. So there's a whole lot of questions right now. And it could just be this administration is literally a week old and they're ironing out some kinks. That very well could be what it is. If there were a review, it's very normal for new administrations to review big policy changes, but there's some confusion right now, I'll have to say, with what the Biden team is going to do. But in terms of what they could do if they do end up deciding to uphold that determination of genocide, it's an open question. And it's interesting to go back and to look at the State Department just a number of weeks ago when former Secretary Pompeo released the decision. State officials were emphasizing this is a political determination. The legal implications of genocide are very real because of the Genocide Convention, which the US is a signatory party to. But a Secretary of State issuing a determination of genocide is a political decision, which means that working out the implications of that are inherently political. And this is one of the issues that is going to bump into a lot of things. And I think there are two ways to look at this. The first is, how is China going to try to shape or limit the United States' ability to make good on that determination? And then secondly, what should the America's response be to that? So yesterday, John Kerry was giving some remarks at the White House at a press conference, and he made a very clear assertion that under no circumstances would the competitive confrontational parts of the US-China relationship ever be conditioned or traded for cooperation on climate issues. And this has been an open question among a lot of China hands in DC for weeks now, as soon as it was released that the former Secretary of State would be in a cabinet level position for climate change. It was, I think this morning, China's spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Defense responded and said that under no circumstances would China would China be dictated to for internal issues and then in the next breath be asked for cooperation on global issues. And this is not a new position of China, but it reveals something in that even though the public stance of the administration is we're not going to conflate these two, we're going to keep them in separate silos, China will find every opportunity it can to try to put the Biden administration in similar positions that the Obama administration and at times the Trump administration were in, which is, do you value these competitive aspects of your China agenda more, or do you value the cooperative aspects more? That choice will be foisted upon the Biden administration as much as China can, and to try to dilute the impact of a genocide finding. So very briefly, what should or what could a US administration do? If we circle back to that original back and forth that you and I had, Ilan, the bottom line was that it's nearly impossible to understand the Belton Road aside from these atrocities in Xinjiang. The United States needs to seize on that. It is not enough to sanction one-off Chinese Communist Party officials, and it's also not enough to focus on US companies engaged in commerce with cotton or like sourcing cotton from Xinjiang. It's a good thing to respond to that problem, but it misses the strategic relationship. Xinjiang matters because it's a hub for Belt and Road commerce, not because it's an export of cotton. If you really want to get to the heart of making China, of holding them accountable for genocide, then you need to respond to them at the very source of their own strategic reasoning. And we need to find a way to hit the commercial flow through Xinjiang that has to do with the Belt and Road. In the research that I did earlier this year that I briefly mentioned a few minutes ago, if we meaning the United States, if we have a little bit of creative thinking and model a response based on the stuff that we've done to combat money laundering and stuff like that, there are very creative things that we can do to really hit China where it hurts and to get at that nexus of genocide and the Belt and Road. It's going to take some creativity, but I think that is the single best thing and most consequential thing that US policymakers could do.
No, that's great. And I think you're absolutely right. This is sort of a space to watch. It's going to determine a tremendous amount. How the Biden administration ends up coming out on the genocide question is going to determine a tremendous amount, not only about US-China policy, but also about sort of US posture in Asia and sort of how it interacts with the Muslim world and things like that. All right, so we are almost out of time. There's time for just a very, very quick lightning round. When we do webinars, sometimes we don't get any questions and sometimes we get great questions. So today's webinar, we're in the latter category. There's some wonderful questions that have been thrown up in the chat. So let me ask each of you just a sort of a targeted question, but answer very, very briefly, right? 30 seconds, a minute. But I just want to get a sense. I want to cover a little bit more of the waterfront. So one question from Taffy Gould is, do the countries of South Asia have more to fear from Islamism or Chinese hegemony? Ajai, over to you. As someone who lives in South Asia, you talked a lot about China and how China's pushing on all fronts and about, the persistent problem of Pakistan. How do you rack and stack sort of the problems that India faces?
Very clearly, the Chinese hegemony is going to be a far greater threat to India in the future. As it is, I see Islamism as a retreating force. May I take just one moment to comment on something Michael Kay had said earlier? He said that we've studied armed groups in negotiations for a long time, and what we have always found is that they tend to use negotiations as a tactic rather than a good faith measure, in as long as they feel they are strong. So he said that the Taliban has no reason to make concessions till the all US troops have withdrawn. What I would like to suggest is they will have even less reason for good faith negotiations and for decreasing violence once US troops have been withdrawn, if they are in fact withdrawn. That's something we must be very careful of.
Perfect. Okay, very good. Let me sort of shift back. Michael Kay, a question for you. And this is a little bit out of the sort of what we've talked about so far, but I think it's useful because I know that you focus on countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, as well as South Asia, as well as Afghanistan. So I've sort of exploited you for your Afghan knowledge, and feel free to respond to Ajai if you want. But here's a question from Charles Weller, who asked about the current state of Islamism in Indonesia. And that happens to be something that you've written about, including for us. in terms of the Almanac. So can you talk just very, very briefly about sort of the Indonesian model, if for lack of a better word, as sort of, about sort of the interplay of civil society and Islam in Indonesia?
Yeah, sure. Much of what I said about South Asia also applies to Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, that you do have a presence, not an incredibly dangerous presence, but a presence of Islamist terror groups, particularly local indigenous groups that are inspired by larger terror groups, including ISIS. You also have some very consequential Islamic political parties that actually do better in elections than they do in South Asia, I'll say that. And then you also have, what I would describe as Islamist civil society groups. One that stands out, not just in Indonesia, but across Southeast Asia and South Asia, is Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a global Islamist group that is nonviolent or claims to be nonviolent, but its goal is to create an Islamic caliphate. Tends to attract a lot of support there in Indonesia and elsewhere from the educated classes, professors, engineers. So it's a very interesting group. But bottom line is it's very similar to what you have in South Asia. Very quickly, I agree to Ajay's counter to mine that indeed, once US forces leave Afghanistan, the Taliban will have even less incentive to reduce violence. My point was that the administration would be wrong if it thinks that it could get any type of commitment from the Taliban before May 1st to reduce its violence. But bottom line, yeah, I think we need to be very skeptical about the situation with the Taliban and its willingness and its incentive to scale down violence.
Great, thanks for that. All right, Michael S., last question goes to you. Very, very quickly. Augusta Petrone asks about the regional retraction from the Belton Road and about countries that have fallen away or essentially have buyer's remorse after buying into China's economic construct. Can you just spend a minute, talk about that, talk about what you're seeing in terms of whether the Belton Road is still popular or if it's becoming less so?
So it's a good question. And last year, one of the biggest impacts of the coronavirus on the Belton Road was this increasing problem of insolvency with a number of countries with their loans. Specifically, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Indonesia, at least Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and I think even Pakistan, and several more beyond those, but a number of countries approached their counterparts in China and essentially said, look, we are having issues with our loans here, and it's mainly because of COVID. And the other interesting thing to layer on top of this, there's been some really interesting data sets that have been getting a lot of attention. One from Boston University near the end of last year, then another from the Rhodium Group. And it kind of gets to this conversation of even before COVID, people were starting to notice a bit of a drop off with Chinese funding for infrastructure projects abroad. Now, that's not to say that the Belton Road is down and out. It's even if a fraction of it is built out, it has the potential to be a huge game changer. But it's important also, while recognizing the significance of the project, it's also equally important to recognize its limitations. And China was in a position last year with several countries where they were having to go through difficult questions of, do we write off this project? Do we change the repayment structure and timeline for this loan? And it's mainly been a case-by-case basis. There haven't been any grand sweeping across the board policies. I think China has been very happy, rather they prefer to look at these as standalone problems, even though it is becoming a bit of a systemic one. But I think the survivability of the Belton Road, given that it's Xi Jinping's pet project, probably is going to have some staying power. But it's a good question because it's a real issue.
No, that's great. Gents, thank you for this truly fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. I'm afraid we're out of time. And I pride myself on at AFPC on keeping the trains running on time. I didn't do quite as good a job this time because the conversation was so fascinating and we talked about so many things. But I want to continue this moving forward. There's lots of issues to discuss. I want to have all three of you back. I want to dig a little bit deeper. Thanks to everybody who joined us on the webinar live. A few housekeeping items by way of conclusion. As I said, the video for this program is shortly going to be posted on the AFPC YouTube channel, as well as on the AFPC website, www.afpc.org. As I mentioned, all three of our speakers are participants in our World Almanac of Islamism project. It's a, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I think it's a tremendous resource. And for all those of you who are interested in the phenomenon of Islamism, on a global or regional or local level, whether it's in Asia or elsewhere, I highly recommend that you check it out. There's a lot of meat there, and there's a lot of chapters and studies and overviews that you guys can dig into, and it's accessible at almanac.afpc.org. So with that, thank you guys once again. This has really been tremendous. I hope everybody circles back real soon. We're in the process of planning our next webinar in this series. And so check your emails. And thanks again to everybody for their participation. Thank you all.